Welcome to Uplift, everyone. My name is Kyle, and I want to thank you for coming. For those of you online, I'm so glad that you are joining us as well. We are in a series called The Big Questions. Little confession, I expected this series to go about 3 or 4 weeks. We're still rolling. We're in week 9. And every time I think I'm going to wrap it up, I'm thinking, I got some more big questions. So that's where we are. We're talking about another big question tonight. And as I've done through the previous few weeks, I just want to begin with a disclaimer. And this is from the words of Jesus in Matthew when he said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind." All of your mind. Loving God with your mind means some intellectual engagement. Means sometimes that you're going to have some questions, and your questions, big or small, are not unwelcome. And I want to make sure that you realize that. Let's begin with the words of Paul, written to his friends in Corinth. He's been through the fire. He's looking to the horizon. We're going to read this from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and we're going to bleed over into chapter 5. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. We're going to be there for a little while during the course of our conversation. This is what he wrote. "We do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen." What a interesting thing to write. We look to the things that we can't see. "For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed, by putting it on, we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always of good courage. We know that in this body, we are away from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil." Our big question, and maybe the most persistent of all the big questions, is the one we're going to talk about and answer. It's this: what happens when we die? What happens when we die? And even though I think intellectually we want to know, we don't really like to talk about it. We don't really like to talk about death. And when we do talk about death, we use phrases, right? Like passing away or losing someone, as if we've lost them and they've just wandered off. We use those phrases, I think, to keep from talking about the reality of this. And our lack of talking about death and what happens later and talking about it rightly is a symptom, I think, of theological confusion. Let me explain. When a society, when a culture loses its belief in a transcendent reality, it loses the language and the courage to face mortality. Death just becomes the ultimate annihilation. And we lean into these, what I call ghosts of hope, right? People live on in memories, or they live on in legacies. And those things, they sound good, but they seem quite thin when a coffin of a loved one is finally closed. So I want us to talk about death for a little while. And really, I want us to talk about what happens next with some gospel clarity. But I really want to flip it. That's okay. Because I think talking about hope is a little bit better than talking about death. Because when we talk about what happens when we die, we have to talk about it with the greatest measures of hope. Because there is an urgency of hope. There's an urgency. We have an urgent need to hope in the right thing. Really, we need to hope in the greatest page turn of our existence. So I want to give you 4 reasons here. There are a few, but I want to give you 4 reasons why I think it's urgent to hope in the goodness of God when you die. And the first is just simply because of eternity, right? Because of eternity. Listen, the Bible has a surprisingly modest view of life. It does. It calls life a vapor, a vapor. It's the puff of your breath on a cold day. It's there, it's gone. I want you to think of the frantic energy we pour into this vapor. All of our careers, our ambitions, our anxieties, they are all focused on this wisp of carbon dioxide. But what about the time that follows? The Bible speaks of that time as ages upon ages. In Revelation 11, it's a vision of time so vast, it kind of, you can't even think about it. It just stills your mind. And that's really meant to recalibrate our perspective and the quality of that time. The quality of that time, its joy or its sorrow is directly connected to God himself, the one who is eternal. Listen, the potential for joy and for misery after we die is by any calculation so much greater than what we can experience in just these few short years, because God is infinite. He's the inexhaustible source of life, and goodness and beauty and fellowship with him constitutes an infinite, eternal joy. In fact, Jesus said that eternal life is to know God. But conversely, to be separated from him is the definition of infinite loss. Infinite loss. Hoping in the right thing has eternal consequences. There's also another urgent need for hope, and it's because of faith. It's because of faith. Facing eternity is when you discover that upon which your faith actually rests. I mean, is it real and substantial? Do you believe in something real and substantial? Or maybe you just believe in God as an emotional cushion for yourself, a set of nice ideas that God gives us to kind of soften the bumps of our life. You know, a lot of modern church leaders, a lot of sermons, they lean hard into this. Church is just a tool for wellness, a social organization. Jesus just is to make us feel better about ourselves. We get good ethical coaching, life hacks. We hear, don't be afraid and have faith and everything works out. And those things are true. They're true, but I want you to listen. A faith that is only for this life isn't the faith of which the gospel speaks. Gospel faith is a bridge that's meant to carry the full weight of your life and your death and your eternity. In fact, gospel faith is a gift. It's a gift of God. Paul said so in his letter to the Ephesians. It's a faith that receives a righteousness that's not its own. This, by the way, is called the doctrine of justification. The believer is declared righteous before God, not on the basis of their merit, but on the basis of Jesus' perfect life and atoning death. This means that our standing with God is based on something entirely outside of ourselves. Thinking about this urgent need to hope in the right thing, it has a lot to do with faith. That's where our hope should be. We also have an urgent need of hope because of our values, right? Thinking about death is really it's a test of our affections. Does the thought of dying fill you with more pain at what you'll lose here or what you will gain in heaven? That's a pretty revealing question. John Calvin, the great reformer of the 1500s, wrote this about us, about human nature. It hasn't lost its weight. It's one of my favorite quotes. Our nature is a perpetual factory of idols. Preferring the gifts of this life over the giver, the idols that we manufacture, is the very essence of Paul's writings in his letter to the Romans. And that charts a devastating course. When a culture turns from its creator to worship the created, it results not just in spiritual confusion, but in social and personal decay. In fact, Paul calls that the wrath of God. Looking toward eternity asks us if our greatest ambition is our own happiness, or something bigger, something more beautiful, the glory of God himself. That's worth our hope. And here's the fourth one. There's an urgent need to hope in the right thing because of courage, because we need some courage, y'all. We need it. When the truth of what lies beyond death, when we face our own mortality, when that truth of that grips our hearts, and we know where we're going, we are released from fear, released from it. I mean, this is the words of Paul, right? In prison, facing death, when he wrote, "For me to live is Christ, but to die is gain." What an amazing statement. That's not just positive thinking, by the way. It comes from a deep, settled confidence about who Paul was and whose he was. We believe through the gift of faith that we are profoundly united with Jesus. His perfect standing before God is counted as your standing. I mean, Paul wrote to the Colossians that your very life is hidden. It's hidden with Christ in God. You know what that means? It's the greatest truth. You're safe. You're safe. You're secure in Jesus. And it's not based on how strong your faith was this morning, but on his finished work. It's settled. It's settled. So when Paul wrote about our appearance in the passage we read before the judgment seat of Christ, we get it. Because it's a good thing. For believers, it's a really good thing because it's a privilege. It's the moment our works are assessed, but not with the determination of destiny. It has to do with reward and not status. In fact, I want to show you this. This is called the Bema. The top are the archaeological ruins. Some of you may have actually been there before. When it was all put together in Paul's day, it looked like the bottom picture. In fact, the Bema is the word that Paul used when he was referring to the judgment seat. This is an actual real place in Corinth. And it was the same word there that he used. It wasn't a place, though, listen carefully, it wasn't a place for criminal trials. We've been taught that. It's not. It was this large raised platform in the city's main forum, their public square. And it was used by officials for speeches and pronouncements and the awarding of public honors, specifically for athletes. So when Paul writes that we're going to stand before the Bema of Jesus, he's saying that's a good thing. This is the moment that our eternal destination is not decided, because that question is settled by faith in Christ's atoning work, right? Our security of salvation keeps this as a moment of deep longing. We can't wait to be there. Not of terror, but this is for believers. By the way, when I'm asking this question, what happens when we die? When I say we, I just want to be candid. I mean believers in Jesus. And listen, if you're not a believer, and if you're watching online and you're not a believer, this is still a conversation for you. It's designed to wake you from the slumber of indifference, to ask you to be open to the Spirit, to the breath of God, to be empowered by God, to consider the claims of Jesus Christ, who spoke of death and eternity with a strange and compelling authority, right? When he said, "I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." Jesus is our only hope. And understanding the hope of what happens when we die, y'all, this is urgent. No more wasting time. But this hope also comes with its own logic. And I think this is really the part that Paul talks about. Because the logic of this hope, of what happens for the believer upon death, this is well designed and prepared by God. This is not happenstance. It's not accidental. It's all purposeful. In fact, Paul gave this divine logic of hope in 2 Corinthians because he knew he was dying. And he was pretty honest about it. Look again at verse 16 in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He wrote, "We do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away. Our inner self is being renewed day by day." The logic of hope here begins with this truth. We're running out of gas. That's the truth. But we will be renewed. There's a little bit of a tension here. I want to read to you a quote from N.T. Wright. And he wrote this in his book, Paul and the Faithfulness of God. And it's a big book about Paul, but this little section I'm going to read to you, N.T. Wright was specifically writing about this passage. And I want to read this to you. It's going to be on the screen, but you can listen. This is what he wrote. This is not a recipe for a quietist introspection, a kind of moral self-improvement. It is the announcement of a new creation reality happening in the present time in advance of the final new creation which is still to come. This is the new creational counterpart to the new covenantal reality of which Paul's already spoken earlier in this book. The inner person, Wright wrote, is being renewed precisely because that is the place where the Spirit is at work, writing the new covenant on the heart. The outer person, and this is great, the outer person is still part of the old decaying creation that's subject to sin and death. This renewal that Paul writes about is the life of the future resurrection age, breaking into our present existence. It's a quiet, daily miracle where the Spirit of God, where His breath, it strengthens our resolve, it clarifies our hope, it reorders our loves. Even as our bodies weaken, we feel the decay of the old world in our bones and the life of the new world in our souls at the very same time. And we're at the beginning of this logic, but this is powerful. And Paul's honest, that decay, it threatens our courage. It threatens our courage. Look what he says. Though our outer self is wasting away, our physical bodies, everything that we're putting our hope in, they're not going to make it. They're not going to make it. In fact, the Bible holds two truths about the body in this really tense balance. On the one hand, it's not a disposable shell. The psalmist wrote that our bodies are fearfully and wonderfully made, right? But on the other hand, our bodies are fallen. They're subject to what Paul called in his letter to the Romans, the law of sin and death. So you've got this tension, right? It's a good thing, but it's also subject to something else. Listen, to understand the rawness of Paul's words, I want us to remember the world in which Paul lived. A couple of months ago, we had Dr. Craig Evans here, powerfully brilliant man, scholar, historian, 70 books and articles, really fantastic to hear him. He wrote in one of his books, Jesus and the Remains of the Day, he wrote a little paragraph about the world of a citizen of the Roman Empire. I want you to hear what life for Paul was like. Listen, this is what he wrote. The Roman presence was oppressive and often brutal. The floggings, the beatings, and the crucifixions described in the Gospels and Acts were not literary embellishments. They were commonplace realities. The archaeological evidence for victims of crucifixion, for example, though rare, confirms the horrific descriptions we read in our sources. To read, and Paul does this later, to read Paul's lists of sufferings in 2 Corinthians is to read the resume of a man who truly bore in his body the marks of a dangerous and violent world. This was the world that produced Paul, and he experienced firsthand the physical pain of that world, but he also knew the logic of hope. This slow decay is the long echo of a story that began in a garden. And it's the constant, visceral reminder that things are not the way they were meant to be. That reality can drain all the hope from your heart, though. It can. And Paul knew it. He didn't pretend that life didn't hurt. In fact, he actually said in the passage we read that we will groan. It's a heavy burden. It's a heavy burden. But he didn't lose heart. Because while the outer self decays, the inner self is renewed by a strange and supernatural kind of focus. Look in verse 18, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Paul, he saw something more than the pain. He saw the purpose of this pain, of this decay. In verse 17, for this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comprehension. Man, what a statement. He called his years of beatings and shipwrecks and sorrows light and momentary affliction. And he wrote that it is actually preparation to receive the eternal weight. So you could feel it in your body, the eternal weight of glory. This is the logic of hope, because decay is productive. It's productive. Richard Hayes is a prominent New Testament scholar. I like what he wrote about how Paul saw his own decay. Listen to this. Paul's understanding of his own apostolic ministry is decisively shaped by this Christological narrative. His sufferings are not mere misfortunes, but are understood as an extension of the afflictions of Jesus. In his own body, he's living out the story of the cross, confident that this path of suffering will ultimately lead to resurrection and glory, not only for himself, but for the churches he serves. This is the apocalyptic pattern. The suffering of the present evil age gives way to the glory of the age to come. Decay and suffering carves out a greater capacity in our souls for the joy that waits us. There's an old church word for this, by the way. I want to show this to you. We don't talk about it much. It's called sanctification. It's an old church word, but it's a good word. Sanctification is where God uses decay to produce holiness. That's what it is. And the book of Hebrews actually suggests this. We've talked about this, that this is the discipline of a loving father. It detaches us from the idols of comfort and self-reliance, and it forces us to rely on the mercy of God alone. That's what sanctification is. That's what the divine logic is, this logic of hope. And this great weight of glory that Paul talks about, it's the final resurrection. He wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1, that his earthly tent, which is our house, will be torn down. But we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens, right? He's talking about that. But here's the rub. If that day doesn't come first, the logic of hope says that another glorious thing is going to happen when we die. Therefore, he wrote, being of always of good courage. We are of good courage, I say, and prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be at home with the Lord. What happens when a believer dies before the Lord returns? This is amazing. You will be instantly, consciously, and joyfully at home with the Lord. You'll be in the presence of Jesus himself. That's amazing. Now, I want to give you some proof of this, right? Because this is all theoretical, but you need some proof, right? So here's what I want to do. I want us to go to the end of the Gospel of Luke in chapter 23, and I want to go to three men suspended on three crosses in the final desperate hours of their lives. Now, two of those men, one on the left and the right crosses, they're more alike than they're different. They're both criminals. They're both in agony. They're both guilty, and they know it. And they both see the same thing. They see the man in the middle. They see Jesus. And they hear the almost unbelievable words that come from his mouth. You know these words. He's not cursing the people who put him there, but he's praying, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. Can you imagine those two guys hearing this? And both of those two guys on either side in their final moments, they want the same thing. They want to be saved. They want that. But they want to be saved in two very different ways. Because the first thief looked at Jesus, turned his head, and actually taunted Jesus, right? Luke 23, verse 39, are you not the Christ? Save yourself. Save us. So this first man, this first thief, he was hollowed out by the world, y'all. The right and wrong of his life, a matter of total indifference to him. Justice was an abstraction. All that is real to that guy is the pain, and it's the nails, and it's the dying, and his only goal is to save his life. That's it. Belief in Jesus for this man is only a means to an end. It's a last desperate gambit. But then there's the other man, right? The other thief. And he refused to be drawn into the cheap cynicism of his companion. Now, he hears the railing. He hears it. And he hears this other guy, the desperate bargaining. He doesn't join in, though. He doesn't join in the cynicism. He doesn't join in and argue for this convenience. And instead, he rebuked him. He rebuked this other criminal with a question. Do you not fear God? Do you not fear God? For this criminal, for this thief, God suddenly became real. God was not a tool. He was not a concept. He was the creator. He was worthy of respect. And this criminal in that moment owned his guilt. Very next statement, we are receiving, he said, the due reward for our deeds. We're up here because we did something bad. This thief has no more will to save face, no more energy to make excuses. There's no place to hide. And not only did he admit his wrong, he actually accepted his punishment as just. So he turned his eyes to the man in the middle, and he made a simple declaration of faith. He saw Jesus' goodness and said, this man, he's done nothing wrong. And then after seeing Jesus' goodness, he saw his kingship. And he spoke to Jesus and he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Both thieves wanted to be saved, but how differently they asked. One of them said, save me. And the other one said, remember me. Toward the railing thief, Jesus gave only a fearful silence. But to the penitent man, Jesus made a promise of breathtaking grace. He said, truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. I mean, it's too good to be true. Not tomorrow, not after some age of purification, today, in just a few hours, Jesus and the thief, after their final breaths, would be together in a miraculous, amazing way. Saint Ambrose of Milan wrote around 400 AD this quote that just bounced around my mind when I read this. More abundant is the favor shown than the request made. They would be together in paradise. That's what Jesus said. In 2 Corinthians, a little later after the passage that we read earlier, Paul actually wrote about being caught up in paradise. He used the word. It was a place so wonderful he couldn't even describe it. And later in the book of Revelation, John saw paradise as the restored Garden of Eden. Tree of Life is at its center. It's the very city of God. In other words, it's this place where everything is made right again, as it is meant to be, as it was in the Garden of Eden. But listen, in all the glories of heaven, and however you define this, the one thing that Jesus chose to mention to this dying thief, the very heart of his promise was this: you will be with me. Oh, you'll be with me. Dr. Alistair Begg, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Dr. Alistair Begg pastored the Parkside Church in Chagrin Falls, Ohio from 1983, just retired this summer. The author, host of a radio show, conference, speaker. If you've heard him, you would recognize him, not because of what he's done, but because he's from Scotland. And he has this great Scottish accent. And he preached a very now infamous sermon on November 20th, 2019, and it's called The Power and the Message of the Cross. You can watch the whole message on YouTube. But in this sermon, this is what made the sermon famous, he started riffing, kind of went off his script, right? Started riffing on this imagined exchange between the angels in heaven and this thief on the cross that Jesus promised would accompany him to paradise. So I'm going to read this quote I'm going to finish this message with an extended quote of what Dr. Begg shared in his message. This is what he said in his sermon. I'm going to do it without a Scottish accent. Think about the thief on the cross, he said. I can't wait to find that fellow one day and ask him, how did that shake out for you? Because you were cussing the guy out with your friend. You've never been in a Bible study. You never got baptized. You didn't know a thing about church membership, and yet you made it. How did you make it? That's what the angel must have said. You know, what are you doing here? I don't know. Well, what do you mean you don't know? I don't know. Excuse me. Let me go get my supervisor. So they go get their supervisor, angel. They come back. So just a few questions for you. First of all, are you clear on the doctrine of justification by faith? And the guy said, never heard of it in my life. What about the doctrine of Scripture? The guy's just staring. And eventually, in frustration, the supervisor angel says, on what basis are you here? And the thief said, the man on the middle cross said, I can come. The man on the middle cross said, I can come. That is the only answer. That is the only answer. What happens when we die? We are with Jesus because he said we can come. That's why.